If Isabella Baker had known that one wrong turn would change the rest of her life, she might have stopped at the stairwell and never opened that door. But fate had its own cruel rhythm, and it carried her forward with a whisper that night. The sound of running water was the first twist. Not the hum of hospital machines, not the sterile buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. This was different. It was warm, intimate, and entirely out of place in the glass and marble office suite of the new hospital CEO. Isabella's hand trembled as it hovered over the doorknob, her heart pounding in her throat. She should have turned away. She should have walked back to the nurse's station, left the thick manila folder of patient reports at the receptionist's desk, and forgotten the assignment. But she didn't. She couldn't. And that was how she saw him. How she saw Mark Carter again, after 6 years of silence. Naked, unguarded, showering in the corner office of New York Presbyterian Hospital. It wasn't the water streaking down his broad shoulders, or the way his dark hair clung to his forehead, that shocked her most. It was the undeniable, impossible recognition. The man under that stream of water was not just her CEO. He was her past. He was the man she had once loved so deeply. She thought she would never recover from losing him. And he was the man who could never, must never know the truth about the little girl sleeping in Isabella's tiny apartment in Harlem. Her breath caught. The folder slipped from her hands, papers scattering across the polished floor with a sharp slap. Mark's eyes flew open, and the world stopped. Who the hell? His voice was deep, commanding, dangerous in its authority. And just like that, the years between them collapsed into dust. Hours earlier, Isabella had moved through the labyrinth of New York Presbyterian like a shadow, the way she always did. At 28, she had perfected the art of invisibility eyes, lowered scrubs, neat hair, pinned back in a tidy bun. Her brown skin glowed faintly under the harsh lights, but her posture, the way she tucked herself inward, made her easy to miss. She had reasons for that. Survival required silence. Her life was not measured in parties or late-night drinks with friends, but in overdue bills and borrowed time. Every paycheck vanished into medical treatments for her mother, who was fighting a disease that refused to release its grip. Every night was split between her 12-hour shifts and the gentle rocking of her daughter, Maddie, to sleep. Maddie with her wild curls and her father's dark eyes. Maddie, whose existence was both Isabella's greatest joy and her most carefully guarded secret. Tonight was supposed to be simple. Deliver the quarterly patient outcome report to the new CEO's office on the top floor. That was all. A task any intern could have handled. Yet for some reason, the assignment had landed in her hands. Perhaps because she was always there, always willing to stay late, never complaining. A nurse no one noticed until they needed something. As she rode the elevator up to the executive floor, she had hugged the folder to her chest, her palms damp with nerves. She hated authority, hated the way men in expensive suits reminded her of the woman who had torn her life apart 6 years ago. Dorothy Carter. The memory alone tightened Isabella's chest like a vice. Dorothy's cold words, her sharp warning, and the check she had pressed into Isabella's trembling hands still haunted her. Leave my son, or I will destroy you. Isabella had left. She had disappeared, and she had built a life in the shadows. She thought she had buried that past forever. The CEO's suite was another world. The elevator opened to a quiet hallway lined with walnut paneling and abstract art pieces that probably cost more than Isabella earned in a year. The scent here wasn't bleach and antiseptic, it was leather cologne wealth. The brass plate on the door read Mark Carter, CEO. The name had meant nothing to her until tonight. She hadn't cared who the new hospital owner was, only that they cut paychecks on time. But now, standing there, something in her chest shifted. Carter. The name felt sharp familiar, dangerous. She knocked. Once, twice, her touch hesitant. No answer. Then came that sound, the water. A steady, muffled rush behind the office door. Her nurse's instinct kicked in. A leak. A broken faucet. Important equipment at risk. She had no choice but to check. Or so she told herself. Her true reason, the pull of curiosity, the whisper of something unexplainable she would never admit. Her fingers twisted the knob. The office beyond was dim shadows stretching across mahogany furniture and a desk too perfect to touch. The water grew louder. A door ajar, steam curling through the crack, like a secret begging to be discovered. "Hello," she whispered. Silence. She pushed the door wider and froze. Mark had not expected company. He had not expected to find himself exposed, caught mid-shower, with only the echo of dripping water to shield him. The woman standing there was like a phantom, a ghost from another life. For a moment he couldn't move, couldn't speak. He had built entire empires since she left him, since the night she vanished with no explanation. He had told himself she was gone, that their story had ended before it began. Yet here she was, standing in his office, clutching the same wide-eyed fear he remembered from when she was 21 and too shy to meet his gaze. But this wasn't college anymore. This wasn't young love in smoky diners and stolen kisses under Brooklyn bridges. This was New York City, 2025. And Mark Carter was no longer just a dreamer in med school. He was one of the most powerful men in the city. "Who are you?" His voice was steel, but inside he already knew. Isabella Baker. Her throat closed. Words wouldn't come. The heat in her cheeks burned as if the entire city had turned to stare at her. She spun, nearly tripping over her own sneakers, and bolted. The folder hit the floor, papers exploding in her wake. Behind her she heard his footsteps, the shuffle of a towel grabbed in haste. But she didn't look back. She didn't see Mark bend down, pick up the folder, and read her name scribbled across the first page. Isabella Baker. And she didn't see the way his expression shifted. First confusion, then recognition, then something deeper. A flicker of a memory he had tried to bury, and the ghost of a girl he had once loved more than his own future. By the time Isabella reached the stairwell, her chest was heaving, her glasses fogged with the rush of her breath. She pressed her back against the cold wall, shaking. She had just walked in on her CEO. The CEO, and worse, the man who had once been her everything. Her mind spun. He couldn't know. He wouldn't know. 6 years had changed her. Her hair dyed darker, her face more tired, her eyes less hopeful. She was no longer the bright nursing student he had once kissed under the New York rain. She was just another nurse, invisible, forgettable. But deep inside, fear coiled. Because fate didn't play games. If Mark Carter had returned into her life, it was not by accident. And if he remembered her, if he discovered Maddie, everything Isabella had fought for would collapse. Back in his office, Mark stood barefoot on the marble, the folder spread across his desk. The name carved into his memory stared back at him. Isabella Baker. It wasn't possible. She had left. She had vanished without goodbye, without reason. He had searched for her, once desperate, angry, but Dorothy had been adamant. "She's gone, Mark. She was never meant for you." And now she was in his hospital, his building, in his life again. Mark Carter, billionaire CEO, master of control, suddenly found himself shaken. And though he told himself it was coincidence deep down, he knew it was fate. Outside, the city pulsed as it always did. Sirens wailing, taxis honking, life moving forward. But in that single night, the first domino tipped. A shy nurse and a powerful CEO had collided again in the most impossible way. And what neither of them knew, what neither could have imagined, was that a 5-year-old girl, with Mark's eyes and Isabella's stubborn smile, was sleeping just a few miles uptown. A girl whose very existence would ignite wars of love, betrayal, and redemption. For now, Isabella only knew the sting of embarrassment and the echo of his voice. For now, Mark only knew the weight of a name he had never forgotten. But destiny had already begun its work. Mark Carter could not sleep that night. The city that usually comforted him, with its unrelenting rhythm, only felt suffocating. From his penthouse window on the Upper East Side Manhattan gleamed like a crown of glass and steel, but none of its light could ease the unease twisting inside him. The folder with Isabella Baker's name lay on the desk, its pages untouched. He didn't need to read them. The moment their eyes had met outside that shower was enough to undo 6 years of careful silence. He poured himself a glass of bourbon and tried to drown the ghost. But ghosts did not leave when you invited them to stay. 6 years ago, she had been everything. He had been 22, a medical student with ambition bigger than his bank account. She had been 21, a nursing student with a laugh that could shatter his worst days. They had met at a crowded library downtown, both reaching for the same medical text, both laughing at the awkwardness of the moment. That laugh, her laugh, had carried them through long nights of study sessions, greasy slices of Brooklyn pizza, and quiet walks along the East River. She hadn't been polished, not like the women Dorothy Carter paraded before him at society galas. Isabella had been warmth, the kind of warmth he never thought he deserved. Her skin had glowed in the city's twilight, her curls bouncing as she leaned over her notes, her eyes bright with hope and grit. And then, without warning, she had been gone. No note, no call, just absence, a silence that hollowed him. Dorothy had told him it was for the best. That girl will only drag you down, Mark. She doesn't belong in your world. He had fought back then, young and reckless, but his mother's will was iron, her influence ruthless. His tuition, his future, the company that was already being shaped for him, all of it could vanish with a flick of her hand. And when Isabella disappeared, he had swallowed the loss like a man swallowing fire. He built walls. He buried his youth beneath success. And now she had reappeared, timid, older, yet achingly familiar, in his hospital. Mark set the bourbon down untouched. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow, he would face her again. Isabella tried to do what she always did when life threatened to crack her open. She worked harder. By morning, she was back in the fluorescent corridors of the hospital. Her scrubs neatly pressed her hair, pulled tighter than usual. Her colleagues noticed nothing. To them, she was still the quiet nurse who never complained, who took the late shifts others dodged, who blended into the background like a shadow. But inside, her world was unraveling. She had seen him, Mark, the one man she had sworn never to face again. Her fingers tightened around the edges of her clipboard as she walked into a patient's room. She smiled, softly, adjusted an IV line, checked vitals with hands steadier than her heart. The patient asked her about her daughter, and Isabella's expression softened instantly. Maddie. Sweet Maddie, waiting at home with her grandmother, blissfully unaware of the storm building around her mother. Isabella's life had been carefully arranged, every piece precariously balanced. The hospital, the apartment, the secret of Maddie's true father buried so deeply, it almost felt safe. But the moment Mark Carter had looked at her again, everything she had built threatened to collapse. She reminded herself he didn't know. He couldn't know. Maddie's last name wasn't Carter. Her curls, her wide brown eyes, people always said she looked like Isabella. The truth lay hidden in the details only a parent could see, in the shadows of expression and the shape of her smile. Isabella had learned to lie gracefully, and Jasper Reed, her best friend, had played along without hesitation. Maddie thought Jasper was her father, and he had never corrected her. Loyalty like that was rare, and Isabella clung to it. But Mark was dangerous not because he meant harm, but because he saw too much. He always had. That afternoon, the staff gathered in the hospital auditorium. Whispers buzzed. Everyone wanted to see the new CEO. Mark Carter, the prodigy who had turned Carter Innovations into a medical powerhouse, the man whose wealth filled tabloids, whose face graced business magazines. Isabella slipped into the back, as invisible as she could manage. She folded her arms, stared at the polished shoes of the doctor in front of her, and tried to make herself small. And then he walked in. Mark's presence was different now. Taller, sharper, wrapped in an aura of command that silenced the room. His suit was tailored, his stride unhurried, his voice steady as he spoke about innovation, patient-centered care, and rebuilding trust in a changing healthcare system. The audience hung on every word, but Isabella felt only the weight of his gaze, because he looked at her. Not once, not twice, but long enough for her stomach to twist. Long enough for her to lift her eyes despite herself and meet his across the room. The jolt was immediate, a recognition that burned. When the meeting ended, she moved quickly, clutching her folder like armor. She could disappear into the hallway, she told herself. Blend into the rush of scrubs and white coats. But she didn't make it. Miss Baker. His voice stopped her cold. She turned slowly, every breath shallow. Mark stood there, close enough to touch, holding out the folder she had dropped the night before. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those blue-gray eyes, were piercing. You left this. Her fingers shook as she took it back. Thank you. The words were clipped, defensive, the opposite of gratitude. She tried to step away, but his voice caught her again. Wait, have we met before? Her heart nearly stopped. The lie came fast, instinctual. No, too sharp, too quick. And then she was gone, retreating down the corridor, leaving him with questions that clawed deeper. That night in his office overlooking the skyline, Mark spread her file across his desk. He told himself it was business, that he had every right to know his employees. But it wasn't business. It was her. Her record spoke of late shifts, exemplary reviews, quiet dedication. No scandals, no notes beyond a small file about her emergency contact, her mother now battling illness, and tucked in the margins, a mention of a dependent, a daughter. Mark's chest tightened. Meanwhile, across Harlem, Isabella tucked Maddie into bed. The child's laughter had been the only light in her life since the night she had lost Mark. Maddie's curls brushed against Isabella's cheek as the little girl whispered, "Mommy read me one more story." Isabella obliged her voice, soft and steady, even as her heart trembled. Maddie didn't know. She couldn't know. Her world was safe, unbroken. For now. But as Isabella closed the book and watched her daughter drift to sleep, she felt the old fear return. Because Mark Carter was not a man who let go. And fate was cruel enough to throw them into the same city, the same building, the same air. Across the river, another storm brewed. Lydia Morgan swirled a glass of wine in her Manhattan penthouse, her smile sharp, as she watched the news broadcast about Carter Health's new leadership. She had known Mark long enough to recognize distraction in his eyes, even from a screen. He was too polished, too controlled, to falter in public. But she knew, and Lydia never ignored competition. Dorothy Carter, too, had not missed the shift in her son's tone during their phone call that evening. She was aging, but her mind was steel. Focus, Mark, she had warned, her voice as cold as it had been 6 years ago. We did not build this empire for you to throw it away on a nurse. Mark had said nothing, but silence was enough. Dorothy knew her son. She knew the past had returned, and she knew who carried it. And Isabella Baker, lying awake in a Harlem apartment, clutching the edges of her blanket, felt the walls closing in again. She had escaped once. She didn't know if she could escape again. What she did know was that secrets had a way of rotting in the dark. And the one she carried, the one with Mark's eyes and her stubborn smile, was about to change everything. The corridors of New York Presbyterian had always been Isabella's refuge. She knew every corner, every hum of the machines, every creak of the old elevator that sometimes refused to climb past the 15th floor. The hospital, for all its chaos, gave her structure a rhythm that steadied her life. But since that night outside the CEO's office, since his voice had cut through her lies with the weight of familiarity, the walls no longer felt safe. Every hallway whispered his name. Every shadow seemed to hold his gaze. Mark Carter had become the presence she could not avoid. His footsteps echoed in her memory, even when he was nowhere near his scent. A mixture of clean linen and faint cedar wood seemed to linger in the air long after he left a room. And though she tried to stay small, invisible fate seemed determined to place them in each other's orbit. It began quietly with assignments she could not refuse. A note from the head nurse assist with data collection for the CEO's new patient care initiative. A request delivered by his assistant, Mr. Carter, would like you to attend the innovation briefing. It was never phrased as a command, but Isabella knew better. When a man like Mark Carter asked, saying no was not an option. The first time she entered his office again, she felt her pulse hammering so loud she feared the receptionist could hear it. Mark sat behind the vast mahogany desk, his suit jacket discarded, his sleeves rolled up, revealing the strength of arms that had once wrapped around her beneath a very different sky. He looked up, and his expression shifted, professional, polite, but softened with something else. Recognition, perhaps, or something more dangerous. "Miss Baker," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "Thank you for agreeing to assist with this project." She wanted to say she hadn't agreed, that she had been cornered by circumstance, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she sat her back straight, her eyes fixed on the neat stack of files between them. Mark leaned forward, his fingers tapping lightly against the folder. "I've been reviewing our patient outcomes. The numbers are solid, but I want more than solid. I want transformative. I need people who understand the ground, the heartbeat of this hospital. You've been here long enough to know its flaws and its strengths. That's why I chose you." The words should have been flattering. To any other nurse, they might have been career-defining. But to Isabella, they felt like a trap. She didn't want his attention, not in the boardroom, not in the ward, not anywhere. Because his attention was dangerous. It peeled back the layers she had so carefully built, threatening to expose what lay beneath. Her throat tightened as she answered, "I'm just a nurse, Mr. Carter. I'm not—" "You're more than just a nurse," he interrupted, his voice firm, but not unkind. "I remember." The silence that followed was unbearable. She dropped her gaze to the papers, her fingers trembling as she shuffled them. She needed to stay professional, needed to draw a line he could not cross. But the problem was, Mark had never respected lines, not the ones drawn by his family, not the ones society tried to carve between them, and certainly not the ones Isabella tried to trace now. Their meeting ended with polite words, but when Isabella left the office, she felt the weight of his gaze following her. She didn't need to turn around to know he was still watching. The gossip began almost immediately. Hospitals were breeding grounds for rumors, stories spreading faster than infection. A janitor had seen her sprinting from the executive floor that night, her face flushed. A nurse whispered that she had been called into Carter's office more than once. Doctors speculated why the CEO seemed unusually attentive to a junior nurse. By the end of the week, the whispers had grown teeth. Isabella heard her name slip from lips as she passed. She ignored them, focused on her charts, her patients, her daughter, waiting at home. But every rumor was another crack in her fragile world, another reminder that she lived in a house of cards. At home in Harlem, Maddie sensed her mother's tension, even if she didn't understand it. She climbed into Isabella's lap one evening, her curls brushing against her cheek. "You look sad, Mommy," she said in her small, certain voice. Isabella hugged her tight, swallowing the fear that threatened to rise. "I'm just tired, baby," she whispered. "But we're okay." She always said that, even when she wasn't sure it was true. Mark, for his part, tried to convince himself that his interest in Isabella was professional. He told himself he needed her insight, her perspective, her experience. But he couldn't deny the truth every time she walked into his office, every time she avoided his eyes, every time she spoke in that quiet, steady voice. He felt the echo of the boy he had once been. And the echo terrified him. Late one evening, he found himself standing by the window of his office, looking down at the city. In his hand was a photograph he had uncovered while sorting through old boxes in his apartment, a picture of him and Isabella, taken during one of their late-night study sessions. She was laughing, her head thrown back, her curls haloed by the dim light of the library. He hadn't even remembered keeping it. Yet here it was, a relic he couldn't throw away. His phone buzzed. Lydia Morgan's name lit the screen. Mark, her voice purred when he answered. "I barely see you these days. You're buried in that hospital." "It's my job," he replied evenly. "It's not just the job, is it?" Lydia's tone sharpened. "I saw the way you looked at that nurse today." Mark stiffened. "You're imagining things." "I don't imagine. I observe." Her pause was deliberate, the silence like a blade. "Be careful, darling. You have a reputation to protect, and so do I." When the call ended, Mark's jaw was tight. Lydia was dangerous in her own way, ambitious, strategic, unwilling to let go of what she considered hers. And though he had never truly given her his heart, he knew better than to underestimate her. Dorothy Carter, too, was watching. She arrived unannounced one afternoon, sweeping into his office with the same authority that had once dictated the course of his life. Her silver hair was pinned flawlessly, her tailored suit as severe as her gaze. "I hear you've been spending time with the staff," she said without preamble, her tone clipped. "Tell me it isn't true." Mark closed the file he had been reviewing. "I meet with many staff members. That's part of the job." "Don't play coy with me, Mark. I know her name. Isabella Baker." Dorothy's eyes narrowed, her lips curling in disdain. "I told you 6 years ago, and I'll tell you again. Now she doesn't belong in this world. And you?" Her voice cut like ice. "You don't belong in hers." Anger flared in him, sharp and sudden. "You don't get to decide that anymore." Dorothy studied him for a long moment, then leaned closer. "I built this empire for you. Every brick, every dollar, every ounce of power. You stand on my foundation. Don't you dare throw it away for a girl who couldn't even hold her place by your side when she had the chance." With that, she turned and left, leaving the scent of her perfume and the weight of her warning behind. Mark sank back into his chair, his fists clenched. Dorothy's control had defined his past. He would not let it dictate his future. But the truth was, his future was already tangled with Isabella's. One evening, as Isabella finished her rounds, she found him waiting by the nurse's station. The sight of him there in the middle of her world unsettled her. He looked too powerful, too out of place against the worn linoleum and buzzing lights. "I need your help with the new data," he said simply, as if he hadn't sought her out deliberately. She hesitated, her eyes flickering to her colleagues, who watched from a distance, their whispers barely disguised. Her instinct screamed at her to run. But something else, something deeper, something she didn't want to name, kept her rooted. "All right," she murmured. They walked together down the quiet corridor, their footsteps in sync. The silence between them was thick, charged with unspoken words. When they reached his office, he held the door open for her, his gaze steady. And for a moment, as she stepped inside, Isabella felt the past surge between them. The library, the East River, the nights when they had dreamed together of futures that had never come. She pushed the memories down, forcing herself to sit, to focus on the charts in front of her. But her hands trembled, and Mark noticed. He always noticed. "Isabella," he said softly. Her name, a confession. "Why did you leave?" Her heart stopped. The question she had feared for 6 years now hung between them, impossible to escape. She opened her mouth, searching for the lie, the excuse, the shield that had protected her all these years. But in the silence of his office, with the weight of his eyes on her, every wall she had built threatened to crumble. And though she didn't answer, though she forced her gaze back to the papers, Mark knew. He didn't know the truth, not yet. But he knew she was hiding something, and he would not stop until he found it. The city was beginning to thaw into spring, but Isabella felt no warmth. She had always loved New York in this season, the tulips pushing their way out of sidewalk planters, the sound of street musicians filling the air outside subway stations, the way Central Park glowed with a quiet kind of hope. But lately, every detail of the city blurred. She noticed only the cold weight of worry pressing against her chest. It began with Maddie's fever. At first, Isabella thought it was nothing more than the usual childhood bug, too many late nights, too much sugar snuck in from her grandmother. But the fever didn't break. It clung stubbornly day after day, leaving Maddie flushed and listless. Then came the bruises, dark blotches blooming across her daughter's small arms and legs, with no explanation. When Isabella asked, Maddie only shrugged and whispered that she didn't remember falling. The fear started then, sharp and merciless. She tried to bury it under work, to lose herself in the rhythm of charts and rounds. But her hands betrayed her. They trembled when she changed IV lines. Her voice cracked when she answered doctors' questions. She moved through the ward as though half of her body still sat beside Maddie's bed in Harlem. Mark noticed. He always noticed. One evening, Isabella stood in the break room staring at a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, her shoulders curved in exhaustion. She didn't hear the door open, but she felt it, the shift in the air when he entered. "You look like you haven't slept in days," Mark said gently, no trace of the commanding CEO in his voice. Isabella forced her spine straight, clutching the styrofoam cup like a lifeline. "I'm fine. You're not." She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat was too tight, her chest too full of the truth she dared not speak. He stepped closer, the scent of his cologne wrapping around her, familiar and disarming. "Isabella," he said softly, her name carrying too much history. "What's wrong?" She shook her head, staring down at the floor tiles. If she looked at him, she knew she would shatter, and she couldn't shatter. Not here, not now. So she did what she had always done. She turned, excused herself, and walked away. But Mark's suspicion deepened. At home, Isabella's fear grew sharper. She watched Maddie sleep, her tiny chest rising and falling in shallow rhythms, her curls damp with sweat. She pressed her lips against her daughter's forehead, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "You'll be okay, baby. I'll make sure of it." But she didn't know how. Her mother tried to reassure her, sitting frail and quiet in the corner of the small Harlem apartment. "Children get sick, Bella. Don't borrow trouble before it comes." But Isabella could see it in her mother's eyes. The worry mirrored her own. She thought of taking Maddie to the pediatric ward during her next shift, but fear held her back. Fear of the diagnosis. Fear of the bills she could never pay. Fear of what it would mean if Mark discovered the truth. Because if Maddie's records passed through hospital files, Mark might see them. He might see himself in her. And then the world she had so carefully built would collapse. Meanwhile, Lydia Morgan's unease grew. At first, she had dismissed Isabella as nothing more than a passing curiosity, a plain nurse with shy eyes and little presence. But she had seen the way Mark's gaze lingered too long. She had caught the subtle shift in his tone when her name surfaced. Lydia was too experienced, too sharp to ignore the signs. So she acted. A quiet meeting with a private investigator over lunch at the plaza. A check slid across a table, her manicured fingers tapping impatiently against the crystal glass. Find out everything about her. I don't care how small. I want to know who she lives with, what she eats for breakfast, what secrets she hides. The investigator nodded. Consider it done. Lydia leaned back, her lips curling in satisfaction. No one steals what's mine. Dorothy Carter, too, tightened her grip. When she visited Mark at his office, her voice carried the same steel as always. I told you to focus, she said, adjusting the diamond brooch pinned at her lapel. Your father and I didn't sacrifice everything for you to squander it on sentiment. This hospital is a business, Mark, not a playground for your heart. Mark leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. I know what this hospital is, better than you do. Her eyes narrowed. Don't test me. You're distracted and I won't allow it. Whatever fantasy you think you see in that nurse, end it now. He said nothing, and silence, Dorothy knew, was the most dangerous answer of all. But the truth was, Mark couldn't end it. He tried. He threw himself into meetings, expansions, contracts, anything to drown out the echo of her name. But he always found himself watching for her in the hallways, scanning the nurses during rounds, listening for the sound of her voice. And when he did see her, when she brushed past him, with her eyes fixed on the ground, his chest tightened with something he couldn't explain. It wasn't just the past anymore. It was the present pulling him in, refusing to let go. The turning point came one stormy night. Mark was walking through the pediatric ward on his way out, his phone pressed to his ear, when he caught sight of her through a glass partition. Isabella sat at the edge of a hospital bed, her hand resting gently on the damp curls of a small girl. The child's face was pale, her eyes half-lidded with fever. Machines beeped softly around her. Something in Mark's chest broke. He didn't know why he stepped inside. He only knew that he did. Your daughter. His voice was low, careful. Isabella froze. For a moment she considered lying. She considered saying Maddie was a niece, a cousin, anyone but hers. But the exhaustion of fear and sleepless nights stripped her defenses. She nodded, her voice a whisper. Yes. Mark's gaze lingered on the child. Something about her features tugged at him, sharp and insistent. The shape of her eyes, the curve of her mouth. Recognition flickered, dangerous and undeniable. He forced it down, telling himself it was imagination. She's sick. Isabella nodded again, tears threatening. She's all I have. For a long moment, neither spoke. The storm raged outside, rain lashing against the windows, thunder rumbling through the building. Inside that small room, the world narrowed to 3 people. 1 woman, 1 man, and a fragile child caught between them. Mark sat down beside her. He didn't speak, didn't pry. He only offered the weight of his presence, steady and solid, a quiet comfort against the storm. And for the first time in years, Isabella allowed herself to lean just slightly into him. Later that night, as Maddie drifted into a restless sleep, Isabella's defenses slipped further. The closeness of Mark, the warmth of his hand brushing against hers, the memories of what they had once been. It was too much. When his lips found hers, it was not calculated, not planned. It was desperation, grief, need. A kiss born from 6 years of silence, from the ache of what had been stolen, from the fragile hope of what might still remain. The kiss deepened, reckless and raw, and Isabella felt herself falling into the familiar fire she had tried so hard to extinguish. Hours later, in the quiet of an empty call room, they surrendered to it completely. No words, no promises, only the pull of bodies that remembered each other too well. When Isabella woke, she was alone. Mark had left without a note, without a sound. but the imprint of his touch lingered, a reminder of the night that had changed everything. Days later, the test confirmed what she already suspected. Isabella stood in the small bathroom of her apartment, the pregnancy strip trembling in her hand. The result was clear. She was carrying his child again. Hope and terror warred within her. Because this time, the pregnancy was not just a secret, it was a lifeline. The doctors had told her Maddie might need a sibling's cord blood to survive. This baby could save her daughter. But Isabella knew the truth: nothing in her life ever came without cost. And with Mark Carter back in her world, the cost might be everything. The strip lay on the bathroom counter, its tiny pink line clearer than any words could be. Isabella stared at it with wide, unblinking eyes, her pulse racing like a trapped bird inside her chest. She had known, of course. She had felt it in the exhaustion that clung to her, the strange nausea that tightened her mornings, the restless dreams that had carried her through sleepless nights. But seeing it confirmed undeniable tore something open inside her. Pregnant. Again. Her first thought was of Maddie. The doctor's words had been precise, clinical, almost merciless. A bone marrow transplant, or cord blood from a sibling, might be the only chance to save her little girl. Isabella had carried those words like stones in her pockets, ever since, weighed down with dread, suffocating under fear. And now, here in her small Harlem apartment, staring at the strip that sealed her fate, she felt both terror and hope warring in equal measure. This new life inside her was more than an accident, more than the echo of a night she couldn't forget. It was a possibility, a fragile lifeline for Maddie. She sank to the tiled floor, the coolness against her skin grounding her as tears spilled over. She pressed her palms against her flat stomach and whispered to the silent room, "Please, please hold on. Your sister needs you." Maddie's laughter drifted faintly from the living room where her mother sat, reading aloud from a book to distract the child from her fever. Isabella wiped her face quickly, forcing herself up. She couldn't let anyone know yet. Not her mother, not Jasper, not even Maddie, especially not Mark, because if he knew, everything would unravel. Mark had been hovering closer in recent days. She felt him in every step through the ward, in every meeting where his eyes lingered too long, in every silence that threatened to break into questions she couldn't answer. Their night together had torn away what little distance she'd tried to maintain. Now, when she looked at him, she felt the ache of what she had lost and the weight of what she still carried. And beneath it all, the fear that one wrong word would reveal everything: Maddie, the baby, the truth that bound them together in ways neither could escape. But secrets were fragile things, and someone else was already circling. Lydia Morgan had always been perceptive. It was how she had clawed her way into the upper echelons of New York's elite, how she had secured her place at Mark's side with poise and strategy. She had built her life on observing details others missed, and she had seen enough now to know something was wrong. Mark was restless, distracted. His meetings ended abruptly, his phone calls unanswered, and every time she caught his gaze, it drifted somewhere else toward that nurse. The investigator she had hired returned to her with a folder thin but heavy with promise. Lydia opened it slowly, her red nails tracing each page. Photographs, notes, records. Isabella Baker. Harlem address. A mother. A child named Madeline Baker. Lydia's lips curled. A child. She turned the page, scanning through receipts, prescriptions, the medical jargon she barely cared to understand. What mattered was not the details, but the implication. That nurse was hiding something big enough to pull Mark's attention like gravity, and Lydia had never lost a battle. At the hospital, Isabella tried to bury herself in work, hoping the routine would drown out her panic. But the walls seemed to whisper louder each day. Her colleagues had stopped being subtle with their glances. Nurses nudged each other when she walked by. Doctors paused mid-sentence when Mark addressed her too directly. Rumors spread like wildfire, and Isabella felt the weight of every whisper burn into her back. One afternoon, Mark stopped her outside a patient's room. His tone too quiet to be casual. "Isabella, you've been avoiding me." Her chest tightened. "I've been working." "That's not what I asked." She tried to step around him, but he blocked her, gently, his height and presence overwhelming in the narrow corridor. His eyes softened, searching hers, pulling at walls she could no longer hold firm. "Talk to me," he said, almost pleading. The words nearly broke her. But before she could answer, a voice rang out behind them, smooth and cold. "There you are, darling." Isabella froze. Mark stiffened, then turned. Lydia stood a few feet away, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her smile sharp enough to cut. She looked between them, with the kind of poised curiosity that felt like accusation. "I've been waiting for you." Mark, Lydia continued, slipping her hand into his arm, as though to remind them both where she stood. "Dinner reservations. Don't forget." Mark hesitated, his eyes flicking once more to Isabella before he nodded. "Of course." When they left together, Isabella exhaled shakily, pressing her hand to her stomach. Already she felt the weight of eyes on her, the sting of whispers. And somewhere deep inside, she knew Lydia Morgan had marked her as prey. That night, Isabella sat at Maddie's bedside, brushing damp curls from her forehead, as the child stirred in feverish sleep. The diagnosis loomed like thunder waiting to crash. Isabella felt the truth pressing harder against her she couldn't hide forever. Maddie's survival might depend on the baby inside her. And that baby's father was the man walking the halls of her hospital. The man whose touch she still felt on her skin. The man who already suspected too much. She closed her eyes and whispered again to Maddie, to the life inside her, to the silence that had become her confessor. "Hold on. Please. Just hold on." But outside forces gathered like a storm. Dorothy determined to protect her empire, Lydia sharpening her claws, and Mark chasing shadows of memory that would lead him straight to the truth. Isabella felt it pressing closer with every heartbeat, the moment when her secrets would no longer stay hidden. And when the first domino fell, she knew there would be no stopping the chain. The hospital smelled of rain that week. Every time Isabella stepped through the sliding doors, she carried with her the weight of a storm she could not outrun. Maddie's condition was worsening. The bruises spread like dark blooms across her small body, her fever spiking with cruel persistence. The pediatric ward became Isabella's second home, her nights spent hunched over the narrow cot, her hands cradling Maddie's frail fingers, whispering lullabies through tears she dared not shed in the daylight. The pregnancy test still lay hidden at the bottom of her dresser drawer, wrapped in tissues, as though secrecy could shield its truth. The child growing inside her was hope and terror, fused into one. Every morning, Isabella touched her abdomen, her palm pressed lightly against a life too new to feel, and whispered the same plea. "Stay. Please stay. Your sister needs you." But hope was fragile, and hope, she was learning, always attracted enemies. Lydia Morgan's discovery of Maddie had not been left to gather dust in a folder. The investigator she'd hired had done his job well, delivering more than Lydia had dared expect. Not just the child, not just the debts, but receipts for medication, hospital visits, whispers from neighbors. A picture was forming, one Lydia could sharpen into a weapon. She had stood by Mark's side at gala after gala, smiled for the cameras, endured his silences. She was not about to let a nurse from Harlem with her modest scrubs and timid eyes unravel years of her careful climb. "You'll end it," she had murmured to herself in the mirror that morning, adjusting a diamond earring. "I'll make sure of it." The plan began quietly with whispers planted where they would spread fastest. A nurse in the break room suddenly muttering about Baker's unusual closeness to the CEO. A lab technician overheard speculating about test results that never appeared in the system. The rumors were small, invisible in isolation, but together they painted Isabella into a corner of suspicion. Then came the cruelty. Lydia found her pawn in another nurse, a young woman drowning in debt, desperate for cash. A meeting arranged in the shadows of a hotel bar. A vial slid across a polished table. A promise that it would never be traced. The instructions were simple: slip it into Isabella's water during a shift. End what had begun before it could grow. The nurse hesitated, but money as always proved stronger than conscience. Isabella never saw it coming. She had been working a double that day, exhaustion pulling at her bones. Maddie's fever had spiked again the night before, and Isabella had sat awake until dawn, cooling her daughter's skin with damp cloths, whispering stories to ease her restless dreams. By the time she reached the hospital, her body was little more than a machine moving on instinct. She drank the water quickly, grateful for the brief reprieve of coolness against her throat. For a while, nothing seemed different. She pressed through her rounds, adjusted IVs, charted vitals, smiled weakly at patients, though her mind was elsewhere. Then the pain began. It started as a cramp sharp enough to make her pause mid-step. She brushed it off, telling herself it was fatigue, stress, anything but what it was. But the cramps grew fiercer, doubling her over, stealing her breath. By the time she stumbled into the restroom, blood already staining her scrubs, she knew. Her knees hit the tile as her body betrayed her. She clutched the counter, her reflection a blur through tears, and the scream that tore from her throat was raw enough to silence the corridor outside. The baby was gone. The hospital walls had heard countless cries of grief, but Isabella's echoed differently. Staff rushed in, hands on her shoulders, voices murmuring words she could not hear. The world narrowed to the blood on her hands, the empty ache inside her, the cruel knowledge that hope had slipped through her grasp before she could even hold it. Mark arrived minutes later. He had been in a board meeting when the call came, but the moment he heard her name, he was already moving. He found her pale and trembling in the ER, her eyes hollow, her body shaking with a grief she tried and failed to contain. "Isabella." His voice cracked, his hand reaching for hers. She recoiled at first, shame flooding her. She hadn't told him. She hadn't told anyone. But now the secret was bleeding out in front of them all, undeniable. Her lips parted, the words breaking as they left her. "It was yours." Mark froze. The sentence struck like lightning, too sudden, too brutal, too true. He gripped her hand tighter, his own chest heaving. "Mine." Her tears streamed unchecked. She turned her face away, unable to bear the weight of his gaze. "I wanted to tell you, but Maddie." Her voice collapsed under the weight of it all. He wanted to hold her, to promise her she wasn't alone, but his mind was already racing, spinning back through every silence, every evasive answer, every flicker of familiarity in Maddie's eyes. A picture was forming, one that terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. But before he could speak, Dorothy arrived. She swept into the ER like a storm in pearls and diamonds, her sharp gaze cutting through the room until it landed on Isabella. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her voice cold. "I warned you, Mark. And now look." "Mother, not now," Mark snapped, but Dorothy ignored him. She bent slightly, her tone dripping with disdain. "You think tragedy will bind him to you, Miss Baker? You think pity is enough to earn a place in this family? You've only proven what I knew all along: you bring nothing but ruin." Isabella flinched as though struck. Mark stepped forward, fury blazing in his eyes. "That's enough." But Dorothy had already turned away, her words lingering like poison in the sterile air. The days that followed blurred into one long ache. Isabella went through the motions, tending to patients with hollow eyes, her hands steady, though her heart was broken. At home, she clung to Maddie tighter than ever, kissing her curls, inhaling her scent, whispering promises that felt emptier with each passing day. The baby had been her hope, Maddie's chance, and now it was gone. Mark tried to reach her, but she shut him out. Every time his number flashed across her phone, she silenced it. Every time he approached her in the hospital, she walked away. Her grief was too raw, her shame too deep. She couldn't bear the sight of him, not when her body had failed them both, not when his mother's words still echoed in her skull. But Mark was not a man to surrender. He began to dig quietly at first, asking questions of staff, requesting records through channels he shouldn't have touched. And the more he learned, the clearer the truth became. Maddie. Her age, her features, her uncanny resemblance to him. He had a daughter. The realization hit him one night as he sat alone in his penthouse, Maddie's photograph lying on the table before him. It had slipped from Isabella's locker days earlier, a careless accident, but to Mark it was proof undeniable. He traced the outline of the child's smile, his throat tight, his chest aching with a mix of wonder and rage. Wonder because she was his. Rage because he had missed 5 years of her life, and under it all, betrayal. Because Isabella had kept it from him. He told himself he would confront her demand, the truth, force the answers she had buried. But when he saw her again, her shoulders hunched in exhaustion, her eyes swollen from tears, his anger faltered. Instead, he stood in silence, watching her move through the ward with a quiet resilience that broke him. He wanted to hate her, but he couldn't. Lydia, however, could. And she did. The news of Isabella's miscarriage spread quickly through the hospital, carried on whispers and sympathetic looks. To Lydia, it was confirmation of weakness, a wound she could widen. She tightened her grip on the nurse she had bribed, threatening exposure unless the woman did exactly as instructed. More rumors began to circulate about negligence, about recklessness, about a nurse whose personal entanglements endangered her patients. Mark heard them, dismissed them, but the damage was done. Doubt crept into the corridors. Isabella found herself questioned more often, her charts scrutinized, her decisions second-guessed. She said nothing, endured it all, her silence, both shield and curse. And when she returned home one evening to find Maddie pale and coughing, her fever climbing higher, Isabella knew the storm was far from over. She sat by her daughter's bed, clutching her hand, whispering into the night. "I'll protect you, baby. Whatever it takes. I won't let them take you from me." But outside her Harlem window, the city pulsed with secrets, and enemies she could not see were already tightening the noose. The city moved on as if nothing had changed, but for Isabella Baker, the world had narrowed to the fragile rhythm of her daughter's breath. Maddie's illness pressed harder each day, stripping the color from her cheeks, dimming the light in her once sparkling eyes. Isabella carried her to the pediatric ward on her days off, her arms aching, but her resolve unbroken. She sat for hours by her bedside, brushing damp curls from her forehead, whispering stories that tried to weave hope into the sterile hum of machines. She had no more secrets left inside her. At least that was how it felt. The miscarriage had stolen her second chance at salvation. The confession that had slipped from her lips in grief had exposed what she had guarded for years, that Mark Carter was more than her past, more than her present. He was Maddie's father, and yet she had not said it outright, not completely. He had pieced it together in silence, in the way he stared at Maddie's photo, in the haunted look that flickered across his face whenever his gaze lingered on the child's resemblance. He knew. She could see it in his eyes, but neither of them had spoken it aloud, perhaps because words would have made it real. Mark's presence grew heavier in her life. He came to the ward under the guise of oversight, though his eyes never strayed far from Isabella and Maddie. He called her into meetings, offered support she could not accept, pressed gently against walls she was desperate to keep standing. There were nights when she caught him watching her with a grief so raw she almost reached out, almost forgave, almost surrendered. But then Dorothy's voice, or Lydia's eyes, or the memory of that check, pressed into her palm 6 years ago, would return, and Isabella recoiled. Her world was already too dangerous, and danger she knew was closing in from another direction. Walter Baker had always been a ghost in her life, a shadow from childhood that appeared only when greed demanded. He had left Isabella and her mother to fend for themselves, chasing a wealth that never stayed in his hands. But blood had a way of tying knots even hatred could not sever, and Walter had found his way back, now smelling opportunity like a predator. "You're working under Mark Carter," he had told her over the phone one night, his voice rough with whiskey. "That makes you valuable, Isabella. Don't waste it." She had hung up without answering, her chest tight, her hands trembling. But Walter did not need her cooperation. He had Nikki, sharp-tongued, bitter Nikki, who had always despised Isabella's quiet strength. And together, they plotted, not for her sake, not for Maddie's, but for the money they thought Mark Carter's name could buy them. It happened on a Thursday evening, the city slick with rain. Isabella had just finished a 12-hour shift, her body heavy with exhaustion, when she returned to the pediatric ward to check on Maddie. Her daughter's fever had dipped slightly, a flicker of relief that loosened Isabella's chest. She kissed her forehead, whispered that she'd be back soon, and stepped out to speak with the attending physician. When she returned minutes later, the bed was empty. At first, she thought she had entered the wrong room. Panic clawed at her throat as she tore through the ward, calling Maddie's name, her voice trembling, desperate. Nurses stared, confused. A janitor mentioned seeing a little girl led down the hall by a woman with familiar curls. Nikki. By the time Isabella reached the exit, her father's car was already gone. Maddie had been taken. Her phone rang not long after. She answered with shaking hands, her voice breaking. "Hello, sweetheart." Walter drawled the words soaked in malice. "Don't panic. Maddie's safe. For now. Where is she?" Isabella's scream cracked the night. "Give her back to me." "You'll get her back," Walter said calmly, "when your friend the CEO pays. 10 million, cash, or the girl disappears." The line went dead. Isabella collapsed against the wall, her body trembling, her sobs choking her. The hallway around her blurred into faceless shapes, voices she couldn't hear, hands reaching but never holding. Her baby was gone. Mark found her minutes later. He had been leaving his office when Jasper Reed, panic etched across his face, rushed to him. "They took her." Jasper gasped. "Walter and Nikki. They took Maddie." The words sliced through Mark like glass. He didn't ask how Jasper knew. He didn't need to. He ran. And when he found Isabella crumpled against the hospital wall, her body shaking, he dropped to his knees beside her. "What happened?" His voice was rough, almost broken. "They have her." Isabella sobbed. "My father, my sister. They took Maddie. They want money. I can't. Mark, I can't." Her words dissolved into a wail that shattered him. He pulled her into his arms, his heart breaking at the feel of her trembling against him. For a moment, nothing else mattered. Not his anger, not his questions, not the years of silence between them. Only her pain. Only the child he now knew was his. "Listen to me," he said, gripping her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "We'll get her back. I swear it. I won't let anything happen to her." Her eyes met his, then wide and wet, filled with the truth she had hidden for so long. The lie could no longer hold. She whispered, broken and trembling, "She's yours, Mark. Maddie's yours." The world tilted, but he did not flinch. He had known deep inside, but hearing it aloud felt like the earth opening beneath him. He closed his eyes, drew in a ragged breath, and nodded. "I know," he whispered. "I know." For the first time in 6 years, they stood on the same side of the truth. And yet it was too late, because Maddie was gone, and time was slipping through their fingers. Mark acted with the precision of a man who had built empires from the ground up. He called his security team, ordered them to trace the burner phone Walter had used. He mobilized resources Isabella had never imagined existed, men in dark suits, flooding into the night with grim determination. But beneath his calm exterior, fury burned. Dorothy had stolen Isabella once. Lydia had poisoned their future. And now, Walter and Nikki had dared to touch his daughter. The city itself would burn before he let them keep her. Isabella clung to Jasper in the meantime, her hands trembling, her breath shallow. What if they hurt her? What if they won't? Jasper said firmly, though fear flickered in his own eyes. Mark won't let it happen. Neither will I. But Isabella knew too well what greed could do, what desperation could cost. She had lived her life in its shadow, and now that shadow threatened to devour the only light she had left. Meanwhile, in a warehouse on the edge of Brooklyn, Maddie sat curled on a dusty cot, clutching a tattered stuffed animal Nikki had thrown at her to quiet her cries. Her small body shivered in the cold, her fever still burning, but her eyes, Mark's eyes, glared at Walter with a courage beyond her years. Walter paced the room, muttering about money, about the life they would finally have once the ransom was paid. Nikki lounged in a corner, her nails tapping against her phone, her smirk sharp. She looks just like him, Nikki sneered, tilting her head toward Maddie. Carter's eyes, Baker's stubborn mouth. You think he'll pay once he knows? Walter's jaw tightened. He'll pay. He doesn't have a choice. But Maddie, too young to understand. Ransom understood enough to whisper one word through her trembling lips. Mommy. Her voice carried through the warehouse, a soft cry against the storm. And in Harlem, Isabella felt it echo in her bones, a sound so strong she knew she would tear the city apart if it meant holding her daughter again. The night closed in around them all. Mark stood at the window of his office, the city spread out below like a map of fire and steel. His phone buzzed with updates from his team coordinates, dead ends, traces of calls that led to nothing. Isabella sat behind him, pale and silent, her arms wrapped around herself, as though holding in the pieces of her breaking heart. He turned at last, his voice steady but his eyes raw. We'll get her back, Isabella, but I need you to trust me. Her gaze met his, filled with exhaustion and grief and the faintest flicker of faith. She nodded, whispering, Bring her home. And in that moment, Mark Carter vowed to the city itself that he would, whatever it cost, whoever he had to destroy. Because Maddie was not just Isabella's daughter anymore. She was his, and no one would take her from him again. The warehouse on the edge of Brooklyn was a skeleton of steel and shadows, its walls slick with rain that seeped through broken windows. Inside, Maddie's fevered breathing filled the silence, a fragile sound that made the air itself feel brittle. She lay curled on the cot, her small hand gripping the frayed edge of a blanket, her lips whispering for her mother in a dream. Walter sat slumped in a chair, a bottle dangling from his hand, while Nikki prowled the space like a restless predator, her sharp eyes flicking toward the little girl every few moments. This isn't sustainable, Nikki hissed, her voice sharp with frustration. She's sick. If she dies before Carter pays, we lose everything. Walter growled, slamming the bottle down. He'll pay. Men like him always pay. But beneath his bravado, doubt gnawed at him. He could see the illness in the child's face, the pallor, the way her body shook. And though greed had dragged him this far, even Walter knew they were running out of time. Across the city, Mark Carter's office had transformed into a war room. His security team had mapped every inch of Brooklyn's industrial outskirts, tracing the ransom call, narrowing down the signal until only one building remained. Isabella stood in the center of it all, pale and trembling. Her hands clenched so tightly they shook. Her eyes darted to the map, then to Mark, then back again, her lips parting to whisper the same desperate plea. Bring her back. Mark turned to her, his jaw set, his eyes steady even as fire burned in them. I will. She believed him. For the first time since this nightmare began, she let herself believe. The storm broke just after midnight. Black SUVs slid through the rain-slick streets, headlights cutting through the fog. Mark sat in the lead car, his phone pressed to his ear, giving clipped commands with a precision that betrayed none of the rage boiling inside him. He had been many things in his life, student son, CEO. But tonight, he was only one thing, a father. Isabella rode beside him, her body tense, her eyes fixed on the blur of lights outside. She wanted to speak, to confess the torrent inside her, the fear, the guilt, the love, but her throat locked around the words. Instead, she reached for him. Her fingers brushed his hand, tentative, trembling. He didn't hesitate. He laced their hands together, his grip firm, unyielding. When they reached the warehouse, the team moved fast. Men in dark gear surrounded the building, silent shadows slipping into position. Mark stepped out into the rain, his suit jacket abandoned, his shirt clinging to him as the storm soaked through. Isabella followed, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. The breach was swift. Doors splintered, boots thundered, shouts shattered the night. Walter lunged for the exit but was slammed to the ground by two guards. Nikki screamed, clawing, spitting curses, before another hand restrained her. And then Isabella's eyes found the cot. Maddie. She ran, her legs nearly giving way beneath her as she dropped to her knees beside the trembling child. Maddie's fevered eyes fluttered open, a weak smile curving her lips. Mommy, she whispered. Isabella gathered her into her arms, sobbing into her hair, pressing kisses across her damp curls. I'm here, baby. I'm here. I've got you. Mark stood a few feet away, frozen. The sight of the child in Isabella's arms, the child who was his blood, his legacy, his everything, stole the air from his lungs. Slowly he knelt beside them, his hand reaching out to brush Maddie's cheek. Her eyes, so achingly like his, blinked up at him. Are you my daddy? The words pierced him. His throat closed, his vision blurred, but he forced the answer out, steady and sure. Yes, sweetheart, I am. Maddie smiled faintly, her small hand curling into his. I knew it. The world seemed to still around them, the rain, the shouting, the chaos, all fading into the quiet bond of a father meeting his daughter for the first time, not in memory, but in truth. Walter and Nikki were dragged away in handcuffs, their curses echoing into the night. Mark barely spared them a glance. They were already ghosts to him, their power stripped, their greed reduced to nothing. What mattered now was Maddie shivering in Isabella's arms, her fever burning her body fragile. They rushed her back to the hospital, lights, flashing, sirens wailing. Doctors swarmed, nurses moved with precision, machines beeped in rapid rhythm. Isabella stayed at her daughter's side, refusing to let go even as specialists worked around her. Mark never left either. He stood close, his hand always within reach, his eyes fierce with determination. The diagnosis came clear and brutal. Maddie needed a transplant. Without it, time was slipping away. Isabella's knees buckled, but Mark caught her, holding her steady. We'll find a match, he vowed. I'll move heaven and earth if I have to. I won't lose her. I won't let you lose her. And for once, Isabella believed him. The days that followed blurred into a battle of hope and fear. Mark poured his wealth and influence into the search, activating international registries, calling in favors from research hospitals across the country. Jasper, loyal as ever, joined the fight, reaching out to contacts, refusing to rest. Isabella lived in the pediatric ward, her hand clasped around Maddie's, her prayers whispered into every sterile dawn. And then, against all odds, the miracle arrived. A donor match in Boston. A young woman who had signed up years ago, never knowing her gift would save a life hundreds of miles away. The transplant was scheduled, the hope too fragile to touch, yet real enough to breathe. On the morning of the procedure, Isabella stood outside the operating room, her hands trembling. Mark came to her, his presence steady, his eyes fierce. "She's going to make it," he said, not as a promise, but as a certainty. Isabella looked at him, really looked, and for the first time she saw not the boy she had lost, not the CEO with the world in his grasp, but the man who had chosen to fight for her child as fiercely as she had. The man who had never truly stopped loving her. Her walls broke. She stepped into him, her arms circling his waist, her face burying into his chest. "Don't leave us again," she whispered. His arms tightened around her, his lips pressing to her hair. "Never. Not again. You and Maddie, you're my whole world." The transplant succeeded. Maddie's fever broke days later, her color returning, her laughter echoing once more through the ward. Isabella wept as she held her daughter, her tears falling not from fear, but from relief. Mark sat beside them, his hand brushing Maddie's curls, his eyes shining with a joy he had thought he'd forgotten how to feel. The storm that had haunted them for 6 years had finally passed. Lydia's downfall came swiftly. The nurse she had bribed confessed under pressure, bank records traced her schemes laid bare. The evidence was undeniable. She was arrested, her name splashed across headlines, her reputation shredded. For all her polish and power, Lydia discovered that even diamonds could shatter. Dorothy Carter, once the unshakable matriarch, fell silent in the wake of truth. Her empire had been built on control, but her grip had slipped. She watched from her penthouse as her son chose the nurse she had once deemed unworthy, and for the first time, Dorothy found herself powerless. Walter and Nikki faced charges too heavy to escape: fraud, kidnapping, conspiracy. Their names became synonymous with disgrace, and Isabella, for all her scars, finally felt free. Weeks later, the sun broke golden across the Hudson River, spilling light through the windows of the quiet house Mark had bought for them. Isabella stood in the garden watching Maddie chase butterflies, her laughter ringing bright, her curls bouncing with every step. Mark came to stand beside her, his hand slipping into hers, his gaze fixed on the child that had bound them back together. "She's strong," he murmured. "She's yours," Isabella replied softly. "Ours." He turned to her, then his eyes burning with everything he had never stopped feeling. "Marry me." The words were simple, but they carried 6 years of silence, pain, and love too deep to kill. Isabella's breath caught her heart stuttering. She looked at him, at the man who had once been her dream and was now her reality, and she nodded. Yes. His lips found hers, slow and sure, sealing not just a promise but a future. Inside, Maddie pressed her face to the window, giggling at the sight. Mommy and Daddy are kissing. And for the first time, Isabella laughed without fear. Months later, the world knew their story. The Carter Foundation launched Maddie's Hope, dedicated to children with rare diseases. Donations poured in millions, raised lives saved. Mark stood at the podium during the opening gala, Maddie on his hip, Isabella at his side. He spoke not as a CEO, but as a man who had lost and found everything. "This is for her," he said, kissing his daughter's curls, "and for every family who has ever fought in the dark. There is hope, always." The applause thundered, but for Isabella the only sound that mattered was Maddie's laughter, and the steady heartbeat of the man whose hand never let go of hers. Their story had begun in shadows torn apart by secrets and betrayal, but it ended here in the light, where love had not only survived, but triumphed. The storm had broken, and in its wake they had found peace.